They say that necessity is the mother of all invention. If a problem exists, someone will eventually try to invent a solution for it. How does that person know that they're the first to come up with such a solution, though? The answer is that in many cases, they weren't. Our ancient ancestors came up with some remarkable inventions, the secrets behind many of which have been lost in the centuries since. Let's check some of them out. Fort Vauban in France is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. It's also considered a historic monument by the French government and has been since 1875. The history of this remarkable site, though, goes back much further in time than that. Fort Vauban was built by the Romans and still contains the ruins of many of the buildings and structures that the Romans created here. Perhaps the most remarkable of them is the Castellum Divisorium. Back when it was new, it would have been one of the most remarkable water distribution systems in the ancient world. It's probably fair to describe Castellum Divisorium as a water tank, although the description doesn't really do it justice. Water arrived in the tank from an aqueduct and was then carried from this central point to the many public baths, fountains, and other monuments of Nemausus by a complicated network of lead pipes. You have to use your imagination to see the site as it once was. Each hole in the base of the stone tank once hosted a pipe, and each pipe could run on for several miles. It's a masterpiece of hydraulic engineering. Our next ancient invention is also water-based, but this time it's a musical instrument. The first hydraulis is thought to have been invented in Alexandria by Ctesibius. The organ worked by filtering compressed air through a container of water to equalize pressure and then emitting sound through rows of pipes. All the pipes were of different lengths, so each pipe produced a different note. These clever water organs would go on to be used in temples, hippodromes, festivals, and Roman imperial courts. The hydraulis of Dion represented a step forward in this type of technology. It was played by hand rather than by water, and had balanced keys that could be played with the lightest of touches. What's left of the 2,100-year-old hydraulis of Dion was discovered close to Mount Olympus, Greece in 1992. 24 of the instrument's open-topped pipes are still present, each set to a different height. The first 19 pipes correspond to the traditional system of ancient Greek music, including one chromatic and one diatonic scale. It's thought that the final 5 pipes form an extension to the diatonic scale, although this is by no means certain. The lower part of the organ, including its air pressing system, was sadly gone by the time archaeologists found it. We're going to stay with the theme of hydraulic engineering a little longer, because now we're looking at a delightfully named invention called a shadoof. It's a type of irrigation tool known as a water life, and it's been in use for at least 5,000 years. Alternative names for the device include counterpoise lift, well sweep, and thula. The invention of the device is credited to the Mesopotamians. The ancient Egyptians came up with their own version around 1,000 years later, and then over the centuries that followed, versions of the shadoof were used by the ancient Minoans and Chinese. In basic terms, a shadoof lifts water from one source and transfers it into either a basin or another waterway. A shadoof is little more than a long pole on a pivot with a bucket attached to one end. It's not complicated, but it's clever. In fact, it's a device so perfectly suited to its intended task that this 5,000-year-old invention is still in use in many parts of Africa and Asia today, especially in India and Pakistan. It's a classic case of if it ain't broke, don't fix it. We've already discussed the ancient Romans in this video, and they're quite rightly credited with inventing many things. They did not, however, invent the Patara pipes of Turkey, even though historians spent many decades believing that they did. We can see why they were confused. The pipes stretch between the sites of many former Roman settlements and outposts in the region, but the Romans built their settlements to line up with the pipes. The pipes were already there when the Romans arrived. Archaeologists are fairly sure about this for a few reasons, the most persuasive of which is that there's no written record of the Romans creating the Patara pipes. The Romans like to write about their achievements at length, so it's odd that they wouldn't mention a marvel like the pipes. The design of the pipes is also totally at odds with the typical ancient Roman architectural style. A Roman pillar was discovered in Patara in 1993, and upon the pillar are inscriptions detailing everything the Romans did during their time there, right down to the creation of basic roads. If the Romans didn't create the pipes, though, who did? There are so many ancient sites to check out in Greece that it's impossible to get around to them all in a single visit. Even if you were to come back 5 or 6 times, though, you still might not get around to the windmills of the Lasithi Plateau. There are thousands of white-sailed windmills standing here, many of which are still in use, just as they have been for hundreds of years. The windmills are on Crete, where a rural community was once dependent on a network of 10,000 windmills for their very survival. The community has been living here for more than 2,600 years. The soil is naturally fertile, but the high water table makes it hard to farm the land because of water saturation. The windmills help to avoid the risk of rainfall flooding the fields and destroying the harvest. They're stone-bodied creations and use wind power to pump water out from flooded zones and distribute it evenly across the fields. There are about 5,000 of the windmills still standing today, about half the number there used to be, and most of them are abandoned. Still, though, they're a lasting monument to the ingenuity of their creators. The umbrella is a basic but important invention. Before someone came up with the idea, you had 2 options when it started raining outside. You could either stay where you were and remain dry, or go outside and get wet. Most people think that the umbrella was invented by the Chinese around 4,000 years ago. This is taught as a fact in China. In reality, though, there's a lack of hard evidence to support the claim. However, we do know that umbrellas were invented to protect their owners from the sun, rather than the rain. The Egyptians first began using parasols 4,000 years ago, about the same time as they emerged in China, and they were used to provide shade rather than dryness. Evidence of ancient parasols also exists in ancient Greece and Assyria. The parasol is probably more likely to have been an Egyptian invention than a Chinese invention, but it's unlikely anyone's ever going to be able to say for sure, and it's not impossible that the idea occurred to both cultures at around the same time. The first waterproof umbrella, though, is definitely a Chinese invention, and first appeared around 3,100 years ago. If you want to make a name for yourself as a historian, try to work out what the real purpose of Volvel paper machines is. They were invented by Ramon Lull of Majorca during the 13th century, but Ramon was quite an eccentric man. He claimed his Volvels could detect absolute truth, which is clearly nonsense. It's possible that they could correctly calculate the date and time, but scientists have differing opinions about that. Lull's Volvel is vaguely similar in design to the astrolabe, and arguably more impressive because an astrolabe is a substantial machine made of steel. A Volvel is every bit as intricate, and yet far more delicate. According to his writings, Lull believed that all nations in the world would unite as one during his lifetime, and the Volvel would help that process along. Through careful study, academics have demonstrated that if you line the hole in the Volvel with the pole star and then center the crossed circles around it, you'll get the approximate date and time, no matter where you are on Earth. If it has functions beyond that, we've never been able to find them. Where would we be today if Johannes Gutenberg hadn't invented the printing press in the 15th century? His creation changed the world, and yet it wasn't just a single creation. It was several all rolled into one. To come up with his world-famous printing press, the German inventor first had to come up with a metal alloy that could melt quickly, but also cool fast enough to create a durable and reusable type. He also had to come up with a new oil-based form of ink that was thick enough to adhere to the metal type, but also capable of transferring onto paper. The style of press he made was nothing like the printing methods that were already in use in his era, and and is more likely to be based on the design of earlier oil or wine presses. None of the techniques Gutenberg used existed anywhere else in Europe at the time, where the dominant method was a fairly primitive variation of woodblock printing. Suddenly, it became possible to print up to 3,600 pages per machine per day. The people of the world came to look to the printing press for news and information, and this is where the term "the press" originally came from. If you're already familiar with the Bar-Bagel Aqueduct and the mills in Fontvieille, France, we tip our hat to you. This is an ancient Roman site that very few people have ever heard of, including people who live in the nearby French city of Arles. It should get far more attention than it does. Historians have described the ancient complex as both the greatest known concentration of mechanical power in the ancient world and the biggest ancient mill complex on the planet. 16 of the overshot wheels that made up that milling factory are still there today. There's a smaller complex like this in the Janiculum in Rome, and historical record suggests there may have been another in Amida, Mesopotamia. The water wheels at Bar-Bagel are lined up in 2 blocks of 8, descending down a steep hillside. They started turning at the beginning of the 2nd century and remained in use for close to 200 years. Based on the scale of the operation, historians believe that the mills could process about 4.5 tons of flour every day. That's enough to provide bread for a population of 10,000 people. According to modern-day historian James Burke, the design of these mills had a direct influence on the Industrial Revolution in Britain. Circus Maximus in Rome was once the biggest sports stadium in the world, and also the scene of the worst tragedy at a sporting event in human history. Its name translates as largest circus, but you wouldn't have seen any clowns here in ancient times. Instead, it was an enormous Roman chariot racing stadium with enough space to accommodate 150,000 people at once. The design of the Circus Maximus became the default template for other arenas that were built elsewhere in the empire, although none were as large as the original. Work on the stadium began 2,600 years ago, and it was built and then rebuilt several times in the centuries that followed, remaining in use for more than 1,000 years. About halfway through that time, in the year 140, an upper seating section of Circus Maximus collapsed during an event. According to contemporary accounts that were recorded in the Historia Augusta, 1,112 people lost their lives because of the accident. The stadium was nevertheless rebuilt and is thought to have staged its last beast hunt event during the 6th century. Concerts are still occasionally held there to this day. How old do you imagine the oldest waste recycling facility in the world is? 50 years, perhaps? Maybe a century at a push? Closer to 200 years in a particularly progressive country, perhaps? Think again. The oldest waste recycling plant in the world is in Dubai, and it's 3,000 years old. It was discovered in 2020 by Polish archaeologists working in the southern stretches of the Persian Gulf. The evidence gathered by the research team suggests that ancient craftspeople came here to smelt metals and make tools using ceramic waste and other leftover materials. In other words, the people who lived here all that time ago didn't throw their broken ceramics away. They brought them here instead, and they used the pieces to make something else. There doesn't appear to have been any limit on their productivity or creativity. Archaeologists have found jewelry, figurines, weapons, and cult objects, all made from recycled materials at the site. What's less certain is why this specific site was chosen for the task. It's miles away from any other settlement and surrounded on all sides by featureless desert. There's no satisfactory answer to the question of who built the world's first robot and when. You could go all the way back to the automatons of Hero of Alexandria if you wanted, but not everyone accepts Hero's creations as robots. If you want a sophisticated, recognizable robot, though, try the digesting duck. It was made by the French inventor Jacques de Vaucanson in May 1739. Vaucanson didn't create a robot because he wanted to impress scientists, though. He created it because he wanted to amuse his peers. Oddly enough, that's exactly why Hero made his automatons too. Jacques would amaze his friends by feeding kernels of grain to his metal duck, which the duck would appear to eat, digest, and excrete. In reality, the grains were deposited inside an internal chamber within the duck, while the pellets of waste came out of another chamber. The people of the time had never seen anything like it before, and so for the main part, they were fooled by the trick. It was even said by some writers at the time that the duck could quack and drink water, although how it could have been capable of this is unknown. Sadly, the duck was destroyed when a French museum burned down in 1879. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications, and you will be the first to know when a new video comes out. Thank you for watching, and see you soon.